welcome, and colleagues of IPAG. It's wonderful to see you. I'm sorry to hear about Shengjin's illness, and please send our best regards. But it's also a reminder, which we keep getting reminded, that nature has to be dealt with. We're still so vulnerable to shocks and disease and epidemics, and we neglect this sometimes at our peril. So I want to send Shengjin our best wishes for a speedy recovery, and also to say that it causes us to reflect. I'm very happy to be back in this room. I was just thinking that this is, for me, a 20th anniversary of being in the room when we launched a project in this room 20 years ago called Emerging Asia, which was a study of Asia's growth prospects for the period 1995 to 2025. And the report came out in 1997, quite an optimistic report that said that Asia's growth prospects were good and Asia would have rapid growth for the coming generation. The financial crisis in Asia came just about 2 months after the release of the report. And the report, in a way, was put aside because of that. But I looked at it this morning, and it's almost completely on track, almost uncannily on track. I want to do a detailed analysis now, but I haven't looked at it in more than 15 years, I think. But the projections were right, that Asia would have a rapid growth. When the 1997 financial crisis hit, immediately voices went up. Krugman always comes to mind, that the growth was a myth, that it was fragile, that it wouldn't last. He's been wrong for 20 years. He was wrong again in an article a couple of days ago, so he's consistent. And what has been true is that growth has been good and strong for a 20-year period, not uniform, but it has been positive. The idea of convergence has more than proven itself during this period. And the most dramatic fact of all is that East Asia has become a true core center of global endogenous growth. And this is really the first case of this in world history since the Industrial Revolution, of a region outside of the North Atlantic that not only grows but is an endogenous growth pole of the world. The amount of innovation and patenting, new products and dynamism coming out of China, Japan, and Korea, which is a basic fuel for global growth, is extremely high. And it's probably the most important dimension of global development in this past generation. And I'm happy to say that economic analysis could foresee this even 20 years ago, that the underlying deep trends could be identified. I think it is our job always to be looking for deep trends, even though we are also concerned with the buffeting of short-term fluctuations. But the short-term fluctuations shouldn't keep us from understanding the more fundamental trends and challenges, and I think that that's very much true today, and I want to emphasize that in my remarks. We have a new situation in 2015 from the situation in 1995. In 1995, the question was Asia's growth and catching up. In 2015, the fundamental question is sustainable development over the coming generation. How to combine the economic development with environmental sustainability and social inclusion. The timing of our meeting is good, because it was 2 hours ago, I think, that the UN General Assembly concluded the post-2015 agenda. and gabbled it. I was just sent the document early this morning. So we now have a globally agreed framework for the period 2015 to 2030. It's a good document. It does focus on basic challenges for the world. It's also quite an accomplishment because our world doesn't agree on almost anything. But here the world and the UN violated my general theorem, which is that if you're given an amount of time to negotiate, you use every second of it till the last moment. Here, the Sustainable Development Goals are to be adopted on September 25th, but they were concluded on August 3rd. This is a good sign for the world. I thought there would be fighting up to the last moment, but indeed there was a determination to reach a consensus, which has been done. Sustainable development is the new medium-term framework that we need to study and analyze. And one of the things I hope is that the ADB takes the lead in this region in asking the question, how can Asia achieve the Sustainable Development Goals? Like the question about growth 20 years ago, this is fundamentally an analytical question, even more than a political question. It's an analytical question to understand what are the challenges of sustainable development and how can they be met. What will we need in terms of systems, governance, technology, regional cooperation, new ways of organizing activity so that the economic development that we have is socially inclusive and especially environmentally sustainable, because that's really where we're off the rails right now. We do not even have a strong conception of what environmental sustainability truly means. There's a huge gap between what the scientists know, what the policy community discusses, and what the world actually does. And these are three completely different realms right now, and we need to bring them together in a short order. Before I get to sustainable development and the new SDGs, the new Sustainable Development Goals, let me say a few words about the basic framework in which we find ourselves, including the short term. I'll remark about 4 different dimensions of the current world scene. First, financial markets. Second, fiscal policy. Third, endogenous growth. And fourth, sustainable development goals. On financial markets, we have been now, since 2008, almost constantly trying to reestablish financial control after financial control was lost, starting in Wall Street and in the global financial system in 2008. We still do not have a working model of prudential financial management that is adequate. And the recent bubble in the Chinese equity markets, both up and down, remind us how fragile things can be and how little we really understand whether the risks are huge or not huge in terms of financial destabilization. We deregulated financial markets in the past generation excessively, but we don't have a model of good regulation that is accepted still today. And with China, we pray for financial stability, but we're not quite sure whether it's under control or whether it really isn't under control. And the whole world depends on it being under control, so it would be nice to know that it is. I've been focusing heavily on the financial situation in the Eurozone, which remains bad. It remains bad because Europe has a common monetary union, but it does not have a common viewpoint about how to run the monetary union. Indeed, it doesn't even have a shared understanding of what central banking is. From the point of view of Germany's central banking is to keep tight credit. From the point of view of many of us, central banking is to be a lender of last resort. That idea of being a lender of last resort is basically rejected by Germany, which doesn't accept that concept, which is more an Anglo-Saxon concept, I would say. And so there is no financial cohesion or coherence in the Eurozone, and that remains a big threat. Greece is insolvent. The economy is suffering at the scale of a Great Depression. The Greek banking sector is closed, which is quite remarkable for a modern economy. The banks have been closed now for more than a month, aside from very small withdrawals. This is as bad as the Great Depression in the middle of our midst, but there's no consensus about what to do. And I've been shocked at the incompetence and ineptitude in Europe on these issues. I've never seen policy making so bad, but I think it comes from a failure of macroeconomic insight in Germany that leads to a very rigid approach which has crushed one of the member states. Because Greece is in such dire condition, we can't rule out a Grexit, even though at a political level and an institutional level, this would be a terrible blow for Europe. And the political leaders know it, but the financial officials don't know how to stop it. And especially the German macroeconomic approach makes it almost impossible to stop, especially since the German finance minister Schäuble has said now on many occasions that he thinks a Greek exit is a good idea, in complete contradiction to his own chancellor, which is quite extraordinary to see this kind of political economic behavior. The problem, from my point of view, is he's more popular than his own chancellor, because the German people also like the idea of no funding for Greece, and they don't understand the consequences of it for Germany. So this is just an example of how we still do not have a working understanding of financial stability in the world. And I would say that we continue to be under the cloud because of this. That was the first point I want to make. I can't give any answers to this because the answers depend on a consensus on approach, which simply does not exist right now. Second is fiscal policy. The main thing I want to say about fiscal policy is that because of aging of the population, and because most fiscal policy in most of the high-income world is about pensions and health care, the budgets are under tremendous strain almost everywhere in the OECD countries. And this is not going to be alleviated anytime soon. So we essentially have a chronic fiscal crisis that will last now for many years, even a generation. It's really a kind of scissors that on the one hand you have one blade of rising fiscal burden from the aging population, and on the other side you have the declining blade of tax collections, given the essentially political and institutional gutting of corporate taxation and high-income taxation in much of the world because of tax competition. So governments everywhere are trying to cut tax collections. At the same time, they're trying to fund programs for an aging population. And this means that the US and Europe are almost incapable now of launching any public goods. because the traditional fiscal policy is under such stress. And so we don't even look to Europe and the United States to do anything anymore on almost any public output initiatives, because there's no will or fiscal space to do that. Even for this bank to be replenished is too hard in the US Congress and so on. And that's the backdrop, not of politics, but of a chronically stressed budget that is pretty much a universal phenomenon in the US, Europe, and Japan. There's just no space. And what we don't know is whether we can run our economies without fiscal space in order to be able to address public goods, build infrastructure, and engage in critical initiatives like climate change or infrastructure. And it's why we have such a difficulty and scarcity of public goods financing. We hope that somehow private markets can fill the gap, but that's quite hard, actually. Private markets are not good providers of public goods. And so we are continuing to be trapped by this structural question. The third area that I just want to mention briefly is endogenous growth. We know that the fundamental drivers of long-term growth are innovation, and this is the overwhelming reason for any long-term growth at all. This has been analytically clear for more than half a century. It's been statistically verified. Countries can grow a lot without innovation by using other countries' technologies, so there's always catching up growth. But the long-term underlying growth of the world economy depends on innovation. We have a debate in the world, in our profession, of whether the engine of innovation is as strong as in the past, weaker, or stronger. My view is stronger. The idea that we face some intrinsic secular stagnation because we don't discover fundamental things anymore, like Robert Gordon of Northwestern has maintained, I think is a huge mistake. We are in a scientific revolution now that I think is as fast and big as any that has gone before during the past 200 years. Of course, this has been a very fruitful 200 years for humanity. It's been every generation enjoying breakthroughs. But our generation is enjoying the breakthroughs of Moore's Law, which have made possible fundamental advances in every area of science, whether it's genomics, biotechnology, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, computing, telecommunications. Every area of technology is in a revolutionary potential, in my opinion, that is extremely positive. Moreover, what I think is very exciting, as I said, is that we now have 3 growth poles in the world, not just 2. We've had for a century the European and the US endogenous growth. Now we have the East Asian endogenous growth that is at least as strong as the other 2. And this is very promising and very important for Asia. It's true, if you look at the Gini coefficient of patenting, there's much more inequality in innovation than there is in almost any other economic aggregate that we look at. The vast majority of the world is not right now engaged in highly innovative activities that shows up in patents. The vast majority of patents come from a few places in the world. And those places are Western Europe, the United States, China, Japan, and Korea. And of course, part of the goal of the coming generation should be to expand the number of countries that are engaged in fundamental innovative activity. And the second part is to use this innovative activity properly. I think that from the Asian point of view, good, close, peaceful, cooperative relations of China, Japan, and Korea is the most fundamental single importance, in my opinion. China cannot grow adequately without Japan's technologies. Japan can certainly not grow without close integration with China's production systems. And taken together, this is an economic powerhouse that's even bigger than the United States economy or the European Union economy. So this is a kind of geopolitical question linked to an economic and innovation question. The good news for East Asia in particular is that the quality of the education systems are so strong, the best in the world in science and math, that there is an underlying engine of good future science and technology that can be fostered in this region. I just wanted to make this basic point because I regard it as fundamentally important for the world and fundamentally important for the Asian economies. This is a great engine of growth for the coming generation. We need to think very hard about how to make this innovation system work as effectively as possible, how to build the university networks, how to strengthen the university to business connections, how to build the venture capital that can help to create more Silicon Valley type clusters around Asia of fundamental dynamism. But I think the promise of rapid, continuing, science-based endogenous growth in this region is very, very strong. So that brings me to the fourth point, which I think is a key organizing principle for us, and that is sustainable development. I want to suggest that sustainable development is the proper focus for thinking about growth in the coming generation, and that the Sustainable Development Goals are a key tool for us and should be taken now, given their adoption 2 hours ago, should be taken quickly and centrally as a way to orient the work of the bank, the IPAG, and the country's programs going forward. What do the Sustainable Development Goals say? They say that economic development must be based on 3 pillars. First, on continued dynamism in infrastructure, jobs, investments, so what we would call the continued mainstream of economic development. Second, on social inclusion, meaning that inequalities that exist in society should be narrowed. There should be universal access to health, quality education, gender equality, an end of discrimination against minority groups as a fundamental social pillar for society. And third, that the growth must be environmentally sustainable in a fundamental way. I would say that the first 2 dimensions, the economic development and the social inclusion, while not fully achieved, are at least relatively well understood. And they have been part of the agenda for the last 15 years. But the environmental sustainability is not well understood. And there, I think, is Asia's biggest challenge, actually, because the future of this region is going to depend, and the future of the world is going to depend on Asia getting this balance right. We do not have a sustainable, environmentally sustainable growth trajectory in Asia or in the world. And to my mind, the most useful concept that we have in front of us is the concept of planetary boundaries as defining various dimensions of the Earth's systems where our economic activity threatens fundamental functioning of ecosystems, climate, oceans, terrestrial biodiversity. The planetary boundaries framework identifies 10 areas of threat, the number 1 of which is climate change. But there are many others that are of great significance, and it's a very useful framework because it's an enumeration of these areas. So human-induced climate change is the number one. The loss of biodiversity is certainly the second largest priority. The Philippines is an example of a hyper-biodiverse region that has destroyed much of its biodiversity and is at risk of destroying the rest through mass deforestation, mass pollution, mass industrial activity that is rather wanton in its effect, and a population explosion that's truly astounding. In the last 100 years, the Philippines population has increased 10 times. That's a lot, from 10 million to 100 million people. And you can imagine what that means for the physical environment. It means almost impossibility of managing the physical environment in a safe way. Other planetary boundaries include the acidification of the oceans coming from the high carbon dioxide loading in the atmosphere, the, of course, stratospheric ozone depletion, the huge nitrogen and phosphorus fluxes from massive fertilizer use that lead to huge eutrophication of the rivers and estuaries around the world, the depletion of various kinds of fresh water, whether it's retreating glaciers, the 60,000 major dams around the world, the depletion of groundwater, the accelerated evapotranspiration coming from higher temperatures, the drying of many of the dryland regions of the world under the pressures of human-induced climate change and so forth. We have a generalized water crisis in much of the world with the scarcity of fresh water. And by the way, one crisis, of course, leads to the next. When we hear about Shenzhen's dengue fever, I was reminded immediately of the drought in Sao Paulo state these past 2 years, which was so severe that the city responded by putting water cisterns throughout the city to collect rainwater, which then became breeding sites for the Aedes aegypti mosquito and have led to a dengue fever epidemic in Sao Paulo. So you have knock-on effects continuously in this way. And then we should include, of course, the soot and the black carbon that hangs over much of the Asian economies and the other extent of toxic pollutants and lack of closure of the industrial ecosystems that mean massive pollution of industrial chemicals. We don't have a working model of how to get this under control. And I don't think we have thought very clearly enough about this. Even looking at the ADB papers that I picked up on the table, for example, Asia's energy adequacy, environmental sustainability and affordability, or environmental issues, climate change, and energy security. These are solid papers, but they're not good enough in one basic sense. They look at these questions, but they don't give quantification adequately of what needs to be done. For example, it's typical to write a paper about energy saying, well, we should move the mix from fossil fuels to more renewables, but without realizing how dramatically the mix has to change in a short period of time in order to achieve climate safety. So just to give you the bottom line on that, COP21 will call for keeping human-induced warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. We're on a trajectory of 3 to 7 degrees Celsius right now, rise of temperature relative to the pre-industrial level. To stay below 2 degrees C with a 66% chance, in other words, still with a 1/3 chance of violating it, the models suggest we have about 875 billion tons of CO2 left that can be emitted in the course of the 21st century. But we're emitting CO2 right now at about 34 billion tons per year. In other words, we have less than 30 years of current emission levels to still have even a 2/3 chance of remaining below the 2 degrees C. What this means is that we have to move not towards modest shifts to low carbon energy, but to full decarbonization of the energy system within the next 50 years. That's what the IPCC really calls for. And yet you look at national plans like the one that Japan filed 2 weeks ago with the UN Framework Convention. It has nothing like that. It's just a modest shift towards renewable energy, completely inconsistent with staying below the 2 degrees C limit. Why might we care about staying below 2 degrees C? For several reasons. One, we like to eat, and the global food supply is profoundly threatened by increases even of that level. We like to survive storms, and we already know that the high-intensity typhoons hitting this country and others in the region have increased markedly over the last 30 years, and that's with a 0.9 of 1 degree centigrade increase, not with a 2 degree or more increase. And because we like to actually walk or drive to work rather than swimming to work, and the most recent evidence is that a 2 degrees C increase could lead to as much as 6 meters increase of sea level through the breaking up of the West Antarctica ice sheet. Jim Hansen, our colleague at the Earth Institute, published last week a paper saying that when the Earth's temperature was last 2 degrees C, the sea level was indeed 6 meters higher than it is today. That's a period called the Eemian period, which was the interglacial period that precedes the current interglacial period that we're living in. In other words, we are at dire risk. So the purpose of the Sustainable Development Goals is actually to create a frame in which we think about growth, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability in a holistic way. It's a new governance challenge because our governments are not equipped to do this right now. They don't have the expertise in-house. The public is not really aware enough, although the public is scared, but it's not aware enough of the implications. Governments are siloed between a weak environment ministry, a strong finance ministry, a politicized infrastructure ministry, a hyper-politicized energy ministry, and so forth. And so we don't generally have sustainable development as a viable governance strategy so far. If you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were just gavelled 2 hours ago, they're good ones. They call for ending extreme poverty, universal access to quality education, universal access to health care, reducing inequalities, ending gender discrimination, controlling climate change, creating sustainable cities, and protecting marine and terrestrial ecosystems. It's actually a wonderful list. It's a comprehensive agenda. Our job is to make that agenda real, to take both quantitatively and qualitatively this call for holism and turn it into an effective technical, analytical, and governance strategy. And so I wanted to conclude by saying how much I hope and expect the ADB to be the regional leader of that effort going forward, because this is the opportunity and it is the fundamental challenge that we face in the coming 20 years. Thank you very much.